Good afternoon and welcome to the local government's roundtable discussion on villages. I want to thank everyone for coming. Take the opportunity to introduce, we have Mayor Scott Strauss from the village of Mineola. We have Mayor Susan Lopatkin from the village of Kensington, Mayor Peter Cavallaro from the village of Westbury, Mayor Ralph Kreitzman from the village of Great Neck, and we have a representative from the New York Conference of Mayors, Barbara Van Epps. Mayor Kreitzman is the president of the Nassau County Village Officials Association, and Mayor Lopatkin is the president of the Great Neck Village Officials Association. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
New York State has over 550 villages, representing approximately 1.9 million people in New York State. We pride ourselves in New York as being a home rule state, so when you discuss things like things that are important to local communities, it's important that we hear from local communities, and there is no, I guess, better example of that than our local villages, closest to the people, and you're the front lines. You provide all of the basic services from paving roads, maintaining parks, providing police protection, in many instances, picking up garbage. A lot of the stuff that sometimes we take for granted. We have a great cross-section of villages from right here in Nassau County. Looking forward to a discussion not only about the last 2 years, where we are. Certainly there's a lot of pressure on our villages today, a lot of pressure on our local governments today, but also I'd love to hear your comments on where we should be focusing as we go forward. We hear a lot about things, we hear the term mandate relief time and again. Well, let's get into it. What kind of mandate relief should we be pursuing? What is going to make the biggest difference for our local communities? Where do we provide the greatest amount of relief? So again, thank you for being here. And before we get started, I'm going to turn to Barbara. As our representative from the New York Conference of Mayors that represents those 550 plus villages and the multiple cities throughout New York State. Why don't we set the tone? Let's talk about a topic that's, I think, important over the last years, has caused a bit of consternation with some of my former colleagues as mayors, and not only for villages but cities, this tax cap. We talk about the 2% tax cap that was passed by the legislature. Important time to put a tax cap. Certainly there are issues and pressures that adds to our local governments. Why don't we talk about the tax cap in general?
Sure. Well, as you know, NICOM was very involved with the whole evolution of the tax cap, and we were very concerned about it before it became a reality last year, because it's hard to oppose a tax cap. Everybody wants to lower property taxes. But we knew that a tax cap without mandate relief was not the way to go and was doomed to failure, because the tax cap does nothing to control the issues and the mandates that are actually causing the increase in property taxes. And that's what we said all along when we talked to the governor's office and the legislature and said, if you're going to put this tax cap in place, you really have to have the mandate relief to go along with it. And unfortunately, we got the tax cap, and to this point, we haven't really gotten the mandate relief we were hoping for. So here we are with this cap in place and giving us little ability to raise revenues, and we still have the increasing costs, particularly on the pension and health insurance side, that we just are having trouble dealing with.
No, I certainly, and that's a theme that we've heard time and again. The price points for local government continue to go up significantly in different areas, and we've now capped revenues. Anyone else have a perspective on that?
I think it was very politically expedient. I think it played well in the newspapers. I think that fundamentally it didn't solve any problems, because it's an artificial cap, and there's nothing underneath that that's giving you any help in controlling your budget, because the mandates just keep driving up costs, and now you have an artificial cap, like a volcano ready to explode as the costs keep going up. I think it was a terrible thing without the relief that we needed.
Well, we'll get to mandates in a second. Well, the tax cap was universal, and certainly it capped increases to that 2% or inflation. It allowed local communities, though, villages, towns, counties, to override the cap with the 60% vote. Now, all of our villages are, for the most part, 5-member boards. So 60% is 3. You need 3 votes in order to pass your budget anyway. So at some point, if you do in fact need to increase taxes, isn't it incumbent upon our elected officials, whether it be at a local level, village level, or otherwise, to make that decision and go out and have that conversation with your residents and say, hey, we need to do it in this case because of A, B, C, whatever those pressure points are, and that's why we're going to pierce the cap?
No one wants to see their taxes in their village go up.
Including us, we're all residents.
No, I say to people, I don't want my taxes to rise. I'm working hard at 0 salary to keep the taxes down. So this, which is my point, this was just a mirage. It did nothing.
Well, you can also put it in perspective by looking at the services we provide, many of which you noted, and many of which we're required to provide. We don't even have a choice. And the fact that, at least in my village taxes are less than 15% of the total. So it's fine to impose it as you know, a broad scope on everybody, but you know, I really don't think it was the villages that were the concern. I think that people look to us more than anyone else for the services they get. When they walk out of their house, everything they see is a village responsibility. And you know, I've talked to people. They don't want their services cut, but they want their taxes reduced. And I look at them and say, tell me how to do it.
We're accessible. Village government, we all know, we're the most accessible part of government. We're seen in the streets, we're seen at the supermarket, at the gas station, we're seeing our neighbors there. We're accountable every day for the taxes, whether they're high or they're low. And for somebody, an outside entity, to tell us, well, you can't raise them more than 2%, well, how do they know what we need or not? So you're telling me that I can't do certain things, or I have to do without certain things, to your point, Mayor, of you know, cut services. I don't want to cut services, and the residents don't want to cut services. That's the services are what we pride ourselves on, making our village great, and why we keep our residents living here, is the services that we provide. And for somebody to come out from another entity and tell us that we have to cut them to stay within that 2% tax cap, ridiculous.
Well, there's a good question that's often asked to me, and that's, why don't you cut your staff? And I said, that's a great idea. How much do you want me to cut? And someone said 20%. I said, okay, I have 2 people in my courtroom. I have 2 people in my clerk's office. What do? Cut off an arm and a leg? You know, it just doesn't work.
You still have to provide those basic services that people have come to rely on.
Well, I think, as Mayor Kreitzman said, I don't think that the villages were really the reason that there was a desire to do something. I also agree with Mayor Lopatkin, where it was a politically expedient or a politically popular thing to do. But I think there are studies that show that the villages are the most efficient form of government. And I think that to tailor a solution like a tax cap that really was directed towards school property taxes more than village or other municipal taxes, and oppose it on a system of government like the villages that are running efficiently, really probably was not, it was too broad a brush, let's put it that way. And I think maybe a little bit more analysis, I think, as Barbara had said, needed to be done on how you control the expense side as opposed to looking at the revenue side, because I think anybody who does budgeting knows a budget is two sides of a coin, and the expense side usually is, at least in my experience in local government, is the one that really needs the most focus.
You know, everyone talks about, and will naturally talk about how the tax caps taxes, but it's still a tax increase. The reality is, having come from a local government background as well, you know, our electricity costs are going up, our labor costs are going up, our equipment costs are going up. It costs more to pave a road today than it did a year ago, than it did 2 years ago. And so as those costs increase, we have to continue to provide those basic services. But you all made an important point. There has to be a flip side of this, which is the mandate relief side. And let's talk about some of those pressure points.
Can I make an observation before we get to even mandate relief? You know, I'm not sure a lot of people understand that villages are very constrained as to the revenues we can raise. I mean, we are required by law to balance our budget every year. We are limited as to the revenues we can charge. You know, people say our building department fees are too high. Our building department fees are supposed to be a reimbursement. They're not supposed to be a profit center.
Right.
We're not allowed to impose fees for many of the things we provide. So basically, Albany requires us to get most of our revenue from tax revenue. Now let's talk about mandates, but also I think there can be some movement in that area, and maybe we can come back to it.
Well, it's a point that certainly is valid and it's worth reiterating. Villages rely on property tax receipts. To a limited amount, they receive monies from those who have justice courts, from parking, fees, or from parking fines. But for the most part, it's revenues from property taxes. As opposed to our towns that receive revenues not only from property taxes, but they receive fees and they receive a portion of the sales tax revenue. Or Nassau County, for example, and I tell people that the Nassau County budget's about $2.3 billion, and they actually receive a little over $1 billion, or $1.1 billion in sales tax revenue, and about $800 million in property taxes. People don't understand that. The vast majority of the monies that they do receive is from sales tax, something that villages don't have a part in. So, important point as well. But mandates, what kind of mandates? We know what the pressure points are. We're talking about pensions, healthcare costs. Both have been skyrocketing over the last few years as revenues have been drying up, as you've dealt with the realities of a tax cap. But there are other mandates out there. Let's get specific.
Wait, the first one is no more new mandates, or at least if you're going to impose them, justify them. Because many of the mandates that are imposed on us, are legitimate concerns. The question is, should our residents have to pay them with real estate taxes? And we get mandates big and small every day of the week, and they've just got to stop or be justified, or increase the AIM funding, which used to be called revenue sharing, which was originally a source of paying for mandates.
I mean, there are big expenses and there are little expenses. There are the big dollars, the pensions, and the percentage that you need to contribute every year. But then you could look at it as death by 1,000 cuts. There's so many little ones that kill you. I'll give you a couple. By law, we have to pay the Medicare Part B deductible for spouses of retired village employees. Why should current village residents have to fund a Medicare Part B deductible for a spouse for someone who never worked in the village? That's crazy. That's number one. It's a little thing, but you add it up across the board, that's got to be a lot of money. We have to cover part-time employees for the share of their pension contribution. In a private industry corporation, you would never, ever fund part-time employees. That's part of the pension design that you go through when you're a corporation. These are two examples of things that are somehow embedded in the calculations. They're outrageous.
I'll say this, and I think everybody understands, when it comes to legislative action, all too often things happen slowly as you try and build consensus around different ideas. And there are things that are important that we do have to build towards, whether it be some form of pension relief that allows for relief to local municipalities, short term, not just 30 years down the road, whether it's trying to deal with some of the issues that cause our health care costs to increase. How do we address them? And of course, as you mentioned, death by 1,000 cuts. There are so many different ways, and I think each one of our villages, and feel free to jump in any time, where there's a one-size-fits-all approach from Albany. There's a rule or a regulation that's passed, and you have to follow it. It may not apply to Great Neck or to Westbury or Kensington or Mineola. It may have nothing to do with the realities of your villages in your areas, but you have to follow them anyway. It was probably meant for some other part of the state. But all too often, Albany passes regulations and, frankly, laws as well with an one-size-fits-all approach, which we're trying to get away from. But let's talk about it. Pension costs have gone up in the last 10 years from, I guess, about $300 million to $6.6 billion. All of that, or most of that, borne by our local communities, whether it's villages, towns, counties, school districts, special districts. The state, of course, participates in that as well. one way or another, that cost gets passed on to our taxpayers. So there were $6.3 billion in increased contributions to our pensions simply because the pensions are invested in the market and the return wasn't there. How do we offset that? The pension contribution rate now for our ERS system, approximately 20%, a little less.
It'll be 18-ish this coming year, yeah. 18.9.
Yeah, but the most significant thing is just the unpredictability and the increase over the last couple of years, because I know that all villages probably within the last 7 or 8 years had years where they had $0 contributed. That was probably not the right approach for the pension system, but that's a percentage that's determined each year by the comptroller's office. And when things were good, I guess they felt like being Santa Claus that year, and they said, you don't have to give us any money this year. And now, like for instance, in a village like mine, we went from 0 several years ago to this year's budget probably close to $400,000 of expense in our budget. So it's very hard as a relatively small municipality managing, trying to build in that kind of increase over a very short period of time, and then wondering what next year has to offer.
Just to contextualize it, your tax base in Westbury is
Our tax revenue.
Your tax revenue generated.
It's about $5.5 million.
So this is approximately what, 8% of your overall tax revenue.
Absolutely.
Going towards pensions, whereas just a few years ago it was close to 0.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so you had to make up 8%. Now, you didn't raise taxes 8% during that period.
No.
So that money had to come from somewhere, which was you doing, frankly, what villages do best. Somebody mentioned earlier that villages are the most efficient form of government. You found efficiencies in order to make up that difference.
Right.
And I think, if we were to go around the table, we would find that same example replicated time and again because, pension costs did go up. It was not and is not unusual. What's it gone up this year? About 20%?
I think it's projected right for next year to be 20% higher than this year, I think. And it was similar to that this year over last year.
Correct.
So I think we've had multiple years of 18 or 20% increases year over year.
Mm-hmm.
And with the 5-year look back, that's got to continue yet at least one more year.
Yeah, probably 2.
From a budgeting standpoint, it would be a lot easier on us all if it was just a set fee or a set percentage of your employees every year.
Mm-hmm.
And through dollar cost averaging, we would know that it's okay. It's 5%, 5%, 5%. We got to increase it 6%. Listen, we all like to have that windfall. No, keep the money this year. We're doing really well. But obviously we're paying for it now.
Right.
That's a great idea. I agree with you.
And if it would
plays
easier on us
into the
budget.
tax cap too.
Yeah.
Because you can predict it for years to come.
Exactly, and it would be easier for us to budget it, and it would be easier for the taxpayers to swallow it, and it would be easier for Albany to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
All the way around, I think would be win, whatever that number is, just like we invest things. Sometimes you win, you lose. But if we budget that same amount, puts that same amount in every year, we'd be okay.
That's similar to the dollar cost averaging effect
Exactly.
of investing. It's brilliant. If we could do that, I think that would take a lot of pressure off the local budgets and the whole process.
Take a longer-term approach to pension contribution rates, and it prevents the volatility that we've seen certainly over the last few years. Certainly a direction that we can try and go in. Obviously, there are pressures there with regard to the need to keep the pension fund fully funded, but I think that there are ways of addressing those concerns as well and provide stability in all of our local governments. It would save, that approach, my understanding is, would save the county of Nassau, one county in the state, literally $60 million, and not 10 years down the road.
Right.
No.
This year. And we all know that all of our localities, struggling as they are, the ability to free up resources to reinvest in other areas becomes very important. So certainly something worth looking at. Some of the other 1,000 cuts, that we look at, whether
It's true.
no, and I wish I could disagree. I can't
I can
disagree
give
with
you
you.
more, but I won't.
And I know that I sit on
Give
the
us solutions.
yeah, well, I sit on the Governor's Mandate Relief Council, and we get together. There are 11 members, 2 members of the Assembly, 2 members of the Senate, 7 members appointed by the Governor, where we're asked to review and evaluate mandates And everyone talks about mandates and mandates in a general term. But when you start looking at individual mandates, whether it's at a local level and local government level, whether it's at a school district level with, special ed,
Well, there are busing requirements.
busing requirements, all of these issues come to a fore. And frankly, we do have to start addressing some of those smaller issues. Try and tackle the larger issues, but a lot of those smaller issues add up significantly over time as well.
Busing is not a small issue. I was just talking to the president of our school board. Again, this is why they used to call it revenue sharing. When busing was imposed, the state, I'm told, paid 80% of the cost. Now they pay less than 20% of the cost, and the requirement is still there.
Or probably worse.
And that's not an insignificant sum.
No, it is significant, and we deal with them really one step at a time. Assemblywoman Schimmel and I sponsored legislation which thankfully made it through to law that allowed some flexibility to our local school districts because of certain busing issues. School districts running empty buses because they had to account for children who didn't take buses even though they may take buses. We do have to, again, I think it's going to be a recurring theme, but I think we have to continuously reconsider our own ability, from our ivory tower in Albany, to be able to make decisions on local issues as opposed to allowing our local communities to make those decisions for themselves.
I think the less regulation that comes down from Albany, the better off the local governments will be, just as a general comment. Because as soon as you have regulation, you have to analyze it, you have to put it in place, you have to spend money to figure out what to do about it, and then you have to review it every year.
And report on it. And
There's so many
hire
attendant
consultants.
tentacles of the regulation itself that add up to just more money expended for something that we could probably take care of ourselves at a local level because we know what is needed.
Or allow us a little bit more input before we're told to do it. And have our voice weigh a little bit more.
Yeah, that's frustrating because even on some of the issues, I know Mayor Kreitzman was dealing with the BOA this year, and that the NICOM folks are dealing with. It's almost as if, not with respect to you or Michelle, who I think were very responsive to the Long Island concerns, but when you get up to Albany, it's almost like everything falls on deaf ears. And these are people, mayors and trustees of villages, are people who represent the people at the most basic level, and those concerns should be treated as legitimate. And I think when people like Ralph or Barbara and her folks up at NICOM go up and talk to legislators, they should carry more weight because it's coming right from the ground up, and that's not often the case, really.
Yeah. We're talking to the people on the street, literally. I know it sounds like a cliche, but we're on the soccer fields with each other. We're on the baseball fields with each other. We're shopping in the same stores. We're walking around town, whether it's walking your dog or going for a walk at night. We're interacting with our residents every day.
And when the time comes to make that decision, which is maintaining that field, paving that road, that's your decision at a local level. And you're the one who's got to realign your resources and rearrange your resources to be able to accommodate the needs of the local community. And your point is well made. We have a bill sitting up in Albany right now that passed the Senate and the Assembly for lever machines. You want to talk about a point of contention, but an important issue for our local governments. We have a machine, a voting requirement that we use a certain type of machine. All of New York State has to use that same scanner machine for voting, but no one ever required the local county boards of elections to provide the machines. And we have situations, including here in Nassau County and other counties in the state, where the local boards of elections do not and physically cannot provide those machines for certain elections, whether it's our school district elections, whether it's our village elections. And so since the law does not allow for an alternative, if you can't get those machines because the Board of Elections don't make them available to you, and we'll get to the cost in a second, you're forced to vote on paper.
Or sticks, like they did lots of years ago.
Yeah.
Or everybody,
A red stick or a green stick.
And so there is a I am hopeful that the governor is going to sign this bill. I think it's an important bill. Again, it's another 2 years. It buys us some time. It's not a permanent solution, but I think people are beginning to understand that they either have to require the local county Board of Elections to provide those machines, or they better provide an alternative, because the idea, and let's take an example of a large village, the largest village in the United States, the village of Hempstead has over 60,000 residents. Can you imagine holding a village election over 60,000 residents on paper? How do you safeguard that vote? How do you maintain the integrity of the election?
How do you count
There's
it?
also a state law that says that you have to certify the vote within 24 hours.
How do you count it? How do you count it?
So it's impossible to do.
It's absurd.
And so I think, look, our village elections are nonpartisan. They are local elections, and there's a need for an alternative to paper. We do not want to take, nor should we ask our villages to take 2 or 3 steps back. But let's talk about costs as well. I mean, in your villages, you have an idea of what it would cost to have to not only pay for renting the equipment, but also pay for the ballots themselves.
The balance, the law stipulates that we have to have 110% of ballots printed for the voters that we have. So for Mineola, if we have 10,000 voters and we have to print 11,000 ballots, typically in a contested election, we have under 3,000 people voting. And that's in a contested election. So we're throwing the other 8,000 away. 8,000 away.
And the cost of the paper is probably 6 times what your whole election costs
Well, wasn't it 55
before you go to the machines.
Yeah.
And it was at 55 cents per piece of paper is what I had heard.
Yes.
That, I think, yeah.
Yes.
But the cost, I mean, and I think the VOA did this analysis. In most villages, it would have increased the cost of running a very local election about 1,000%, almost 10 times.
And that's assuming we can get the machines.
Right.
In Nassau County, and actually Mayor Cavallaro and I met with the 2 Board of Election commissioners, and it isn't always they don't want to. They have budgets, but in Nassau County, maybe we're always unique. But I think they indicated we have an election 10 out of every 12 months, and some are just a few weeks before. So getting the machines reprogrammed for 30 or 40 village elections, and we're only talking villages, we also have, of course, special districts and all, is near impossible. And the worst part is, if they agree to do it and we're ready, and then the machines are impounded because the election the month before had a contested vote. Some people around here know about that.
Yes.
There won't be any machines available, and we just won't have elections.
There's a step forward.
The best we've been able to find, if the county can't give them to us, is there is a company that will rent us the machines. Nassau County, New York State requires us to use. The problem we have is that we would then, as opposed to the county, have to buy a license. And we haven't been able to come down with numbers, but I've been hearing numbers of $100,000 to $400,000 to buy some of these licenses.
And so
how could you do that?
it's absurd. It is, frankly, it's a huge step back. Now, we talk about the need to move forward, provide relief for our local levels of government, but also, obviously, our taxpayers. Yet here we are imposing a requirement that, frankly, if you sit back and think about it, for a local election, where typically you're going to have, even in a village that has 11,000 voters, in an uncontested election, which oftentimes they are, you're going to have a couple hundred people come out. We need to maintain the integrity of the system and the integrity of the vote, which is something that it's obviously becomes rather difficult, if not suspect, when you get to voting by paper.
I mean, the other option is just buy a machine and keep it in your back office someplace, a lever machine.
But you can't use it.
Well, that's where some of the, again, there has to be some rationality in what the legislature does. Again, in this instance, it's another instance where the legislature, with a very broad brush, said what's good for a very small school district or a fire district or village has to be the same as it is for a statewide election. That doesn't really make any sense. I mean, we were running our elections very well with the mechanical machines. You know, there were occasionally some contests, but they were always decided pretty promptly. The mechanical machines were very reliable, and so for the legislature to say that instead of being able to use those machines that you've used forever, you have to now use this new kind of machine for whatever reason at a cost of 10 times what it used to cost you to run your village election. It's just not rational.
But it's an education process too, because I met with a number of legislators, and unfortunately the ones from New York City have no concept of Nassau County or otherwise, because New York City doesn't have a lot of elections.
Every November.
But also a lot of them said federal law, AVA, requires it, and federal law doesn't require it. But there are still people 4 years later, 3 years later, who still believe that there's no reason to change this because federal law requires it.
Federal law requires that machines be used and certain types of machines be used for federal elections.
Federal elections, right.
And I think all of us, and I know all of us are very sensitive to access to voting places for persons with disabilities. The whole idea of these new machines being more accessible to persons with disabilities, I think is understandable, and I think it's laudable. The reality is, if those machines simply are not available, there has to be an alternative. Mm-hmm. And the alternative can't be paper or sticks or hand vote or voice vote. There has to be an integrity and a basic integrity to the system that we have to protect. So I am hopeful that the governor is going to sign this bill. It'll give us another 2-year window, but during this 2-year window, we are going to have to address it. And Mayor, as you mentioned, in Nassau County, we have village elections in March. We have,
And in June.
well, I was going to go chronologically. You have village elections in March. You have school district elections in May. You have village elections in June and some primaries in June. You have primaries in September. You have elections in November, and you have special district elections throughout the year.
A lot in December as well.
Mostly in December. So you have a lot of elections going on. Each one obviously important to the locality where that election is taking place. We're better than this, and we should be better than this, and we should be able to reach a compromise that makes sense. And certainly when we're dealing with state issues, state elections, county elections, let's say partisan elections, where you're more than likely to have a larger voter turnout, let's make sure we use the machines and the equipment that they've asked us to use. But when you do have your local school district, village, special district elections, if these lever machines are available, why should we not be able to use them, especially when those other machines are not?
Well, and the goal here is not to impose anything on anyone, but to let the local jurisdiction decide if they can properly run an election that has the integrity that's required, to use the method that works best for them and their residents.
Right. The elderly have a difficult time with the electronic ballots.
That's true.
I look at my grandparents, and they're way up there in years. God bless them. My grandmother's got trouble signing and writing. How do you fill in those little tiny circles when you could go into a lever machine and just flip the lever? It's fine, and it'd be so much easier on them, as well as every other resident most residents coming in. You're just flipping a lever rather than trying to see in an auditorium, a large gym, with the lighting is poor. They have a little light there, and they're crowded around, and they're trying to fill in those little tiny holes or circles. Operationally, it's not.
Have you seen the new handicap machines? I've been talking at every election. I sit down and talk to the inspectors of election who tend to do it at every one. And they said that no one in their experience has been able to productively use those machines. Every single person has needed a lot of help. And of course the goal here is to let people cast their ballot in private, not to have someone over their shoulder pushing their fingers. And when we met, when we were lobbying for the Assembly bill with Sheldon Silver, we brought a handicapped person up who said that the lever machines are absolutely the easiest for him, and he went through a host of reasons. He was incapable of using the new machine.
Here's an interesting statistic, and we got this from the State Board of Elections. There are over 1,600 of those machines for persons with disabilities throughout New York State. And in the last statewide election in 2010, where these machines were used throughout New York State, 1,600 machines, a total of 1,200 people used those machines, which was less than one person per machine. And so, the reality here is, again, I understand the need. I understand and am very sympathetic to ensuring, and I think it's a requirement that we all feel very strongly about, that we ensure that everyone has access to the voting machine and access to the polls and access to a means of being able to vote independently. But I think we oftentimes forget that many people, whether it's senior citizens or many people with disabilities or many people who can't get to the polls for whatever reason, still vote by absentee ballot. And our system allows for absentee voting even in our local elections and in our village elections. So if there is really a concern where the machine is not accessible, there are other options available as well.
Well, the absentee ballots actually, I mean, if someone wants to come and vote, I don't want to stop them.
No.
The absentee ballots even work better because if you're permanently disabled, you only have to submit the request once, and then you will be mailed the form every year automatically. How much better can that be?
Right. And so you're absolutely right. No one wants to prevent somebody from being able to exercise their right to vote in a way that they want. But at the same time, there are alternatives. And so if the other alternative is people are going to vote by paper, then these other alternatives that frankly have been in place for decades. These lever machines haven't been around for a couple of years. They've been around for many decades. And so they've worked over the years.
They're efficient. There's no reason to give up on them.
So here's a hope that the governor reviews the bill and signs the bill soon and provides everyone with a modicum of relief, because if that bill isn't signed this year, as of January 1st, every election has to use the new machines, no exceptions. All of our school district elections, all of our village elections, all of our special district elections will have to use these machines. And for the communities in counties where those machines simply are not available, it means paper.
And in some villages, you have 4-year terms. Ours is 2-year terms, so we're having that cost every year.
Right.
Yes.
So that's another issue that we have. Every year we're going to pay that
Staggered
cost.
2-year terms. You have an election every year.
Yeah.
Mandate relief. There is a mandate relief council. There is a website out there. Whatever suggestions you have, or anyone who may be watching, whatever suggestions you may have with regard to mandates, issues that you would like us to consider, please let us know.
I'll put a plug in for Barbara because NICOM, and I have to confess,
As a member of the executive board,
I took someone's seat on the executive board of NICOM, the gentleman sitting over there. But I'm being honest that I have a bias, but they have a website called stopthetaxshift.org.
That's right.
And it lists only about, I think, 70 or so.
Oh, it's actually come down. I'm happy to say we were able to take a few off, so we're below 50 right now.
Okay, but those are 50, and those are really the bigger ones. They're not the tiny cuts, of which there are hundreds of more. So if people want to see 50 of the more important ones, they can just go right there, stopthetaxshift.org.
Thank you. There's been some talk of late about these super control boards. We've heard reports on TV of communities, not only in New York State, but across the United States, that are struggling, some considering filing for bankruptcy. The fiscal pressures on these communities are such that that the idea of a fiscal oversight board was something that was floated around in Albany just a couple of weeks ago, with some people saying that they would be open to it. The idea that there would be a super control board that would oversee many different communities, counties, towns, villages that are facing financial hardship and on the verge of, frankly, not making ends meet, was something that, you know, that had been floated. I'll reiterate my point that I made earlier, that New York is a home rule state and tries to focus on local governments and provide independence to local communities to make decisions for themselves. Having said that, the idea of a control board, super control board that's going to step in, and let's remember something for a second. That means that Albany gets to step in and make decisions for a local community as to how they spend their money and what they spend their money on. It doesn't necessarily reassure me, and I would probably guess that it doesn't reassure anybody sitting around this table, that we have the ability to make those decisions for local communities where perhaps they're struggling with certain ideas. The whole idea of a control board sometimes is very difficult for me.
I think you've said it all, really. All the help we can get, you know, if they want to give us financial help and analysis and ideas, that's terrific. But we've been elected by our local residents to do a good job. If we're not doing a good job, fire us and vote for someone else next time. If you impose a board that second guesses everything we do, then you have non-elected people who don't, in many cases, know your residents, making decisions for your residents. I just think that's backwards.
I also think it says something about the electoral process, just as you said. You have a group of unelected people making decisions for a group of elected people, and where is the accountability in that? And unfortunately, oftentimes, it's those elected people who have been entrusted with not only the ability to do good things and positive things, but sometimes the ability to have to do some things that perhaps won't be received so well, but that's why they were elected to begin with.
You got to backtrack a little bit and put into perspective the fact that you say we have over 550 some odd villages in this state, and that is the form of government that this state employs. We either want to support that form of government by empowering us to control our budgets better by getting rid of some of the extra expenses that we shouldn't have to pay. If the flip side of that is put some control boards in, what they're really saying is we don't need you and we want to get rid of villages.
Oh.
So I think that we have to be very careful with the whole notion of control boards, because I think it's a slippery slope and I don't think we want to be there.
I don't disagree with you. I happen to think that this is the purest form of democracy, you know, when we're dealing with our local governments. But there are people in this state who would think nothing better of having our villages consolidate, getting rid of different layers of government, and think that perhaps somehow by making government larger that it's more efficient. I have never seen an example where larger government is more efficient government. I have never seen, and I can tell you, and I know having worked with each of you, and from my own experience in local government, that it doesn't get any leaner or more efficient than it does at the local level, because the level of scrutiny and accountability is such that you don't see on different levels or higher levels of government. That's the concern. There are people who will try and encourage dissolution of villages, and for the sake of, again, larger government. But larger government for the sake of larger government is, has, in my experience, has always been more inefficient.
Maybe we can talk to that law just for a minute, because as you know, there was a law in New York that provided you could dissolve or consolidate villages. The law was changed to make it, if I can just summarize it quickly, easier. It has lots of flaws. And my statistics may be a little stale, but Barbara knows them all. But if my memory serves me correctly, the 2 years before the new law came into effect, there were 13 votes. 7 of them were to dissolve. Now, those were all done under the old law, where you studied the process. It was done by either the governing board or a large group of residents. And obviously they were thoughtful, and half of them succeeded. Since then, the last count I had was 13.
There's
14.
14 one
14.
ended in a
and
dissolution.
only one of them resulted in a dissolution. So there's something else that you made it easier. What you did was made it more costly because people are voting before they know the result of their vote. But I think it tells a lot. You made it easier, and more people have decided to keep local government.
Mm-hmm.
There was a recent proposal for the state to take over secret determinations from local villages.
That wasn't a proposal. That was someone who I think perhaps misspoke.
I think there was some discussion about setting up some regional decision-making on that. But anyway, I mean, I think that's a pretty ludicrous proposition to have somebody in Albany deciding, whether some mitigation measure on Main Street in Smithtown is the right thing to do. That's usually something left up to the local people to do. But
it has to be that way,
right.
Mayor. A secret determination, a determination of local impacts can only be done at a local level and has to be done by the lead agency, which oftentimes, 99 times out of 100, is going to be our local village or our local town that has an interest in making sure that they preserve the quality of life of people in the area.
But I was trying to get back to your point on the control board, and I think probably the only more ludicrous thing would be to take this spending of local money, tax revenue and whatnot, and put it in the hands of Albany and say, well, if the local elected officials aren't able to do that, we're going to somehow have a control board or whatever. Nassau County has been basically operating under essentially a control board or something akin to it for several years now. That really hasn't produced a lot of really significant results in terms of at least of materially improved economic conditions for the people in Nassau County. So I don't know why anybody would think that trying to do that on a village level. Mayor Kreitzman, I think, made a good point. If the state wants to provide resources to troubled, municipalities in terms of expertise or ways of thinking about problems that the local officials need help with, that's one thing. But to actually impose on local municipalities how the money should be spent and what decisions should be made, I think is really probably the worst idea you can really think of.
There's a big difference between coming in and helping local
Right.
governments as opposed to coming in and taking over.
A clearinghouse of best practices allow people to learn from each other, perhaps give examples of where other communities have been successful. The idea of Albany coming in, as scary as that may be today, I would probably say that was a much scarier proposition a few years back when Albany was considered to be one of the most dysfunctional legislatures in the country. And so I will give kudos to the governor and to the legislature that has passed 2 on-time budgets, cut spending year to year the last 2 years, has shown fiscal restraint and fiscal discipline that perhaps was lacking for many years before that. And it has actually, I think, worked collaboratively across the aisle to get things done. So the prospect of Albany coming in, although I'm not advocating for that, in fairness to Albany, they themselves and we in Albany have gone along and come a long way in the last couple of years.
I agree. I wasn't trying to imply that. My only point is that you're talking about local decisions and local problems really need to be solved locally. And, Albany knows what Albany knows, but I think mayors and trustees kind of know what's important to Main Street and on Main Street, and that those decisions really should be left to them. And I think, again, it comes down to accountability. If they're not able to cut it, then I think that the electorate will make the changes that they need to make. But if Albany can provide resources like a clearinghouse or whatever, or even legislative solutions to make it easier for government to do the things that they need to do to recover economically, that's a much better approach than trying to impose on local municipalities what the right thing for them to do is, in my view at least.
I couldn't agree with you more. There's a Long Island Regional Planning Council or Long Island Regional Development Council that is one of 11 regions across New York State. Last year, the Long Island region was awarded over $100 million for projects here on Long Island, many of them within our local municipalities, some having to do with some of our businesses and reinvesting in our businesses. There's money that was given to the village of Hempstead to redevelop sewers in their downtown that would allow for expanded redevelopment. But there are examples around Long Island, and so I want to take this opportunity. Part of our economic engine in New York State, and certainly right here on Long Island, is in our downtowns. Our economy goes as our downtowns go. And, we can talk all we want about mega projects and, the hub in the center of Nassau County and large redevelopment projects and the Ronkonkoma hub out in Brookhaven. But the reality is, it's in each and every one of our local downtowns where this battle is fought each and every day. The small business owner, the person who's going to open up a restaurant or a shop, employ a couple of people. I just want to reiterate that this council is still there. There is still ongoing requests for grants, and if there are opportunities in your own downtowns, in your own communities, in your own business communities, or for infrastructure needs that you may have in your villages that would lend themselves to allowing for an investment from New York State that would allow for a greater development in your own communities. Mayor, in the village of Westbury, you have a wonderful project. You have the Performing Arts Center, which is going to be literally a game changer in the downtown. And the idea of investing in one project that is going to pay dividends across the downtown is significant. Mayor, with the Winthrop University Hospital building an $80 million facility in the downtown, bringing literally hundreds, if not thousands, of people to the facility that are going to be able to shop in the downtown. These are the kinds of things that I think lend themselves to what you said before, and Mayor, what you mentioned, which is the state coming in with resources and putting those resources where they are able to have the best impact. So what kind of projects can we expect? We have a performing arts theater. Anything going on in the local communities that we should be looking out for?
We're just a residential village. We have one commercial entity and one apartment house. So our projects are really very basic. We're roads, we're trees, we're lighting, police. It would be nice to have some sort of state or local or regional help for some of those projects, because they would help us tremendously.
Infrastructure improvements, road paving, those are...
That's important.
Those are big things. We don't have any retail establishments, but certainly we have water runoff and we have stormwater issues to contend with and all of those things.
We talk about these issues all the time. You deal with villages and you're asking that local municipality and the taxpayers in that municipality to absorb the expense, oftentimes for the entire region, whether it's parking, whether it's maintaining the roads, whether it's parks, there is a burden. I hate to use the word burden, but there's an obligation on that local community because those facilities are within that jurisdiction. There should be a means of being able to provide some relief and some help when you're dealing, especially with those communities that do take on more of that regional approach to providing services.
Well, I think there are ways, and it would require state legislation, there are ways for the state to assist regions like Nassau County or Long Island as a region and this happens in other parts of the country, where when there are regionally significant projects that have impacts beyond the specific locality where there's a benefit by having a big tax increase because the tax revenue increase because of some project that's going on, that there's a way to share that revenue with all the affected communities. That's definitely something I think the state of New York really should be looking at. So, you have a lot of opposition on Long Island when you're talking about projects like the hub, the big mega projects. I think you'd have less opposition if there was a way for communities that are around that mega project to see a benefit of supporting it, because they are going to get detriments in terms of traffic and some other detriments. But if the state had a mechanism like other states do for sharing that revenue regionally, I think a lot of those negative comments would go away and probably facilitate projects of that nature to get done. But I think I agree with the mayor that infrastructure money is crucial. We have an aging suburban infrastructure, and I think all of us can speak to the fact that we have drainage issues and paving issues and things that and which do lead to economic activity in our communities. If you can get in and out, you can park. Those are things that people will utilize to come through downtown.
And that's what people see. They're looking at the roads. They're looking at when there's potholes. Are they being repaired? Is it cold patch? Is it hot patch? Did you do the whole street, or did you do a little piece of it?
And we used to joke all the time that You've patched the road so many times that eventually it will become paved.
Right.
Yes.
This has been great, and certainly I want to thank all of you for having participated. We do have challenges going forward. Mandate relief, in a specific sense, has to be part of that. Understanding what those cost drivers are, pension costs and the like, have to be part of it. But we, I think, understand that, and certainly I do. We're in it together. We all represent the same people, and we're all trying to pull in the same direction. I'm looking forward to your input as we go forward and tackle these issues in the next couple of years.
Well, thank you for including us in the conversations, because it's so meaningful, at least to me, to know that when you're in Albany, you're understanding what some of the local issues are. It's so important.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and thank you for joining us. We'll get together again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.